Hello, everyone. I wanted to create a brief screencast that's sort of meant to replicate some of the things we may have talked about in class, in just sort of walking through the chapter and talking about what some of the main ideas at work here are. So, the first thing that the chapter talks about is we have this sort of knee jerk reaction to new technology. And yes, it's usually prompted by older people who are like, oh no, the world's ending, kids these days, get off my lawn. And we see a lot of this. The example that they talked a lot about in the book was the telegraph. So people were using a very abbreviated kind of language to convey their points of view. So you see that apocryphal example in the book where an author is talking to their publisher and they want to know how the book sales are going, and they only send a question mark via telegraph, and then the response is an exclamation point. So this was sort of bemoaned as the end of the flowery language of the Victorian era, and people were not going to use adjectives and adverbs anymore, and the way that people speak was going to become telegraphic in nature. So very short, very direct. In fact, a lot like we actually use when we are doing texting now. But the other example in the book, of course, is people saying that erasers were going to make students lazy if they were on pencils, that there was going to be more errorful writing because there wouldn't be any real consequences. This happened also when people introduced correcting tape on typewriters. Yes, I do remember having to use a typewriter to write some reports, and correcting tape was a wonderful and beautiful thing. And when people were moving into more technological, computers were becoming much more widespread. Word processors were an extremely contentious, if you will, approach to how people were going to communicate with each other, because it took away a lot of the labor of writing. So if we think about it now, if we want to move a paragraph from one end of the paper to the other because it's going to look better there, then that's a change of a few seconds. When people had typewriters, that meant retyping the entire thing. So people were concerned about that kind of a thing, but maybe more relevant for what we're talking about in this class is good old spell check. The idea was that people would not be able to spell as well if they knew that there was going to be a program that would just suggest the proper spelling for them. Now, this is still a debate that's happening on Facebook and other places where people are making this argument. Obviously, there are examples of secondhand kind of things, or people saying anecdotal evidence. I'm fairly sure my mother's spelling has gotten worse since she's gotten spell check, but that's just me. So some of these things may have some reality, but the important thing to take away from this is that there's this sort of instantaneous no thanks, I hate it response to any new technology from certain segments of the population. Now, there may be an equal but opposite reaction from people, other parts of the population, who say, ooh, it's new. I'm very excited about this and I'd like 3 of them, please. So we have to kind of find that middle ground in between the early adopters of a technology and the people who are very, very anti that particular piece of development. Original texting looked quite a bit different from the texting that we do today. This is clearly one of those chapters designed to make me feel old, but people were using more abbreviations during the time. It had a lot more features of abbreviation, of leaving things out, of trying to shove as much meaning as possible into as few characters. So that brings us to the real question. Does modern texting encourage abbreviation? Now, back in my day, because apparently that's how I should have started out this lecture, most text messages, so SMS characters, were a maximum of 160 characters, and providers charged not by the character, but by the message. So the kind of text messages I send every day to my husband, where it's just one letter, K, where I'm acknowledging something he has told me, would have been kind of an unthinkable extravagance when I was in early college because of the price of sending text messages. You really wanted to shove all that meaning in there as much as possible. Abbreviations allowed for more content. Your goal was to send as few text messages as possible, but to make them as detailed as possible. Now, obviously, sometimes that meant half of your text messages were, "What did you mean by insert obscure abbreviation here?" So, the other thing you have to think about is when people were texting, they were still using the alphanumeric keyboard. So if you wanted to type the letter S, for instance, that would involve pressing the 8 button 4 times in order to get to that point. So it was a more complex kind of a system. It wasn't quite as quick as what we have with modern smartphones. So a lot of this is reminiscent of how Twitter used to be when it was first online, where people weren't really doing threads. They were kind of embracing the micro nature of Twitter, but they still had a lot of things that they wanted to communicate. So if you had 140 characters and you wanted to communicate the hilarious thing that your dog has been doing or your displeasure with the current administration, then you had to get creative with abbreviations. Now, this was a relatively short period in time, however. Twitter now is 280 characters, and tweet threads are extremely common. So people just use this micro platform in order to tell multiple parts of the same story. Also, concurrently with early texting was chat rooms. And chat rooms had a tremendous amount of abbreviation. Probably the most famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, is the ASL abbreviation, which stood for age, sex, location. So as soon as anybody entered a chat room, they would get an ASL request from somebody in there, probably somebody who was lying about their ASL, in fact. Chat rooms were kind of the wild, wild west of the internet when these were first becoming more commonly available to people. So a lot of abbreviation, a lot of trying to get things out very quickly so that you were staying with the main flow of the conversation. So in that case, it wasn't about it was about efficiency, but it was a temporal efficiency. I want to stay relevant in the conversation, so I need to get my response out in a hurry so that I'm still responding to the most recent scroll, essentially. Early text messaging, chat rooms, there was no image capability, so emojis were punctuation. I have a theory that, and maybe I need to test this one day, that the best way to tell if somebody is Gen X or Gen Y is to ask them to come up with an emoji. If they use punctuation to do their smiley face or whatever, they're probably Gen X. If they have an image of a little yellow smiley guy, probably Gen Y. So, the crux of this matter is, though, that none of this is really true today. So much has changed in the last 25 years when this was becoming initially a technology that people were interacting with on a daily basis. Now we have predictive text, now we have spell check within our text messaging. We have a tremendous amount of technological innovation that has changed what this looks like. So, one thing I want to talk to you about is abbreviations. When people say technology is killing the way young people use language today, what they're almost inevitably talking about is abbreviation. So, I want to make a quick point here. The book mentions this in a footnote, but uses the term acronyms as the blanket term, which is how most lay people do use it. It's worth noting, however, acronyms are spoken, like NATO or laser or scuba, whereas initialisms are where you actually pronounce each letter. So IMHO, IDK, BRB. Now, abbreviations have existed in language since the beginning of complex language usage. Makes sense, right? We have things we want to say quickly, and so we start using a shorthand that is agreed upon. It's also a valuable tool for establishing an in-group versus an out-group. So, if a group understands something that outsiders do not, then they are more likely to be able to identify the in-group from the out-group. So if you are playing a game with somebody and you type AFK and somebody doesn't understand that that means away from keyboard, then that person probably isn't as entrenched in the online gaming community as you are. So, a lot of times abbreviations, become acronyms as they become more widely used, or they're more popular, if possible. So, in the beginning, people used to, when they were taking LOL from the keyboard to spoken language, they used to say LOL. That's a bit cumbersome, right? That's a little bit hard to say. So what did it become? It became LOL. So NATO probably very much evolved along the same lines. So typically, if something can become an acronym, it's going to, but it's going to be over a process of time. We also have numerical substitutions, so B for great. These are not unique to English and they're not unique to texting. We didn't come up with anything new and amazing here. If you take a look at the hieroglyphics example on pages 197 and 198, you'll see some examples of ways that the Egyptians did this. So it wasn't with numbers, but very much playing with the idea of taking a morpheme, so an individual word, and using it for its sound rather than for its meaning. So, license plates are another really good example you see around quite a bit. Finally, another abbreviation that we have is representation of how we say something rather than how we write it. So this could be dropping of silent letters, like in Fortnite, right? It's NITE, or shortening. One of the classic examples here that you see not just in text messaging or technology, but pretty much any drive-through diner or restaurant that you might care to go to is the shortening of through, THROUGH, into THRU. So mirroring how it is actually pronounced rather than how it's written. So you'll see this a lot. You'll see things online like LUV instead of LOVE. So a lot of these quicker shortcuts to typing out commonly used words. However, that doesn't explain everything. So, for instance, was WUZ versus was 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 an extremely common thing that you would see in text messages initially, and you'll still see it on places like Reddit or more informal message board kind of things. This doesn't save you any time. WAS is closer together on the keyboard than WU and Z are, so why would people do this? And I think that the answer here is that it was about forming in-groups and out-groups. So trying to create a linguistic system where you could identify people who were new. Because when we're talking about technology, there's often, I suppose a class system isn't an inaccurate way of putting it, for early adopters versus people who have just come to this technology, right? If you're playing a video game, what do you call somebody who has just started playing the game that you have more experience with? They are called noobs, right? So, same kind of an idea here is that part of the reason we use abbreviations or alternate spellings is for efficiency's sake, to make it faster, clearer, what have you. But part of it is also to create in-groups and out-groups that can be easily identified. So what is abbreviated? What gets abbreviated? Negative examples that are talking about how language is destroyed by texting, things like this, tend to show really high abbreviation rates. They will abbreviate every possible word. And what they end up with isn't actually a realistic reflection of how people text. What they have is a realistic reflection of shorthand, which is something that is still used by people in various professional careers, but not used in text messaging. So, sorry about that. But they'll have abbreviation rates that are something like 80 to 90%, when that's not what we really expect to see in a standard text message. If you look at the examples on page 200, they're attesting 18 to 40% abbreviation rates. When I looked back at my text messages, my rate was more like 0.5%. Why? My phone has predictive text. I can text fairly quickly now because I've had a fair degree of practice, and I don't very rarely do I have text messages that have to be responded to instantaneously. So a lot of it depends on my audience, a lot of it depends on my need for the technology to work in a certain manner. But that 18 to 40% attested abbreviation rate is much, much more typical. So as we close this lecture, I want you to think about what you do. What kind of abbreviations do you use? How often do you use them? Do we count things like contractions? Contractions are some of the original abbreviations in English. If we think about, for instance, John's book, the actual phrase is John, his book. That's what they would have said in early modern English. So we're thinking about Shakespeare. We're talking about that kind of 1600s sort of language. Do most people even recognize that contractions are abbreviations, or at least possessive contractions? Probably not anymore. How do you form emojis? Do you have a vast arsenal of emojis that you use? Where do we put things like GIFs into this discussion. All of these questions are important ones as we continue studying the role of technology. So for your discussion board coming up, you're going to interact with some technology. And this is less about how we use technology to communicate and more about how technology might be able to communicate with us. So, I will speak to you all again soon, and be well.